Okay, folks, so let's start. First of all, welcome to our, I think this is our 6th UCM talk for the 2019-20 series. My name is Gail Corrin, I'm the Higher Education Manager at UCM, and at UCM we absolutely believe one of our roles and one of our duties, in fact, is to encourage informed debate beyond the boundaries of our courses and qualifications that we deliver at UCM. And our UCM talks schedule is eclectic of the people who have come to this talk tonight. You're going to see some folks from QE2 and from UCM, as well as the elected members. We've got coaches from sport, so that sort of represents the eclecticness of our talk. The last one we had was all about breakthrough work in cancer identification. So if you're interested in our talks and you're an eclectic kind of soul, do keep track of them. They're on our UCM website, and you can, they're also on Eventbrite, so you can book in and give you some idea of who's going to come. Tonight's talk is with Richard Sille. Now, we're very lucky because Richard Sille works for us. He's one of our own, he's a UCM lecturer, but he is so much more than that. And when I was talking to Richard earlier, first degree was geography.
Yeah. Came
back to the old man, became an accountant. Did that for a while. Got the feeling it wasn't for you, and so did a distance learning sports psychology degree at the University of Derby whilst he was being an accountant. So, what is that here? What a mindset.
I had 2 kids during that time as well, so yeah, it was a busy time.
And clearly found his passion and his vocation there. And once he completed his degree, then actually stopped being an accountant and went away and did a Masters in Sports Psychology at the John Moores University. Has now come back on the island, is in the midst of his PhD, some of which we'll hear a bit about in tonight's presentation, and has got his own sports consultancy business as well as doing some work here lecturing for us on our sports coaching degree. So I think we're in for a really interesting talk. I'm sure anyone in this room has got an interest in sport, but it's so much more than that. I'm always aware of the parallels of sport into life, you know, the transferable concepts and whatever. So Richard, thank you for giving up your time and putting together what I hope will be a great night. How this goes is that we tend to, it doesn't have to go like this, but roughly, Richard presents for about 40 minutes and then we have chat and questions and whatever. But the truth is, if something has to be asked in the middle of all that, I'm sure we'll answer it. So if you have a burning question you don't want to forget, or something so controversial you can't resist challenging it, please interrupt as you go.
Yeah, I think there's probably 45 minutes of material, so there'll be plenty of time for questions.
Good on you. I present to you Richard Sille.
Okay, thank you, Gail. Thanks very much. Thank you, everyone, for coming. You said about an eclectic mix of talks, and it's been challenging to put together a talk for a varied audience, so hopefully there's something for everyone in this talk tonight. So as Gail said, I'm Richard Sille. I work as a performance psychologist, supporting athletes, parents, coaches, teams, organisations. Do that mainly through one-to-one service delivery, through workshops and through some seminars as well, that type of thing. As Gail said, I'm a lecturer here at UCM on the foundational degree in sports coaching. I'm also, in fact, I've got a class in this room, so it's a bit like a busman's holiday for me. I'm also a researcher, teaching assistant and doctoral student at Liverpool John Moores, so I'm spinning a lot of plates at the moment. Haven't dropped any yet. So this is the content that I'd like to cover this evening. So exploring the discipline of sports psychology, how it's developed, looking at some different models of practice. I think that's an important area to get over. Looking at different ways that athletes can benefit from sports psychology support. And I'll finish off by sharing some of my research experiences as well. I've really enjoyed the research element of this, so there's quite a lot on that tonight. So professional athletes realise the importance of sports psychology, and at the top level athletes are so closely matched physically and technically. It's often the psychological elements that differentiate them. Competition often turns on moments of psychological fortitude or psychological errors. So I don't know if anybody watched the rugby at the weekend, France against Scotland. So that match turned on a a French player losing emotional control, punched another guy, got sent off, cost them the match, probably cost them the Six Nations title. So one incident, can change things dramatically. So that's why psychology is so important in sport. And there's 2 recent episodes with my kids that have really brought home to me the impact that psychology can make from a young age, as well as those high-level athletes. So first, it was my 4-year-old. I can't remember the context, but something happened, and I reacted to it, and then she came out with this gem. She'd learnt it at play school, it turned out. So what does it mean? It means something happens, an event that's neutral, and then we react to it, don't we? We put something positive or something negative onto it. But essentially it's a neutral event, and we choose how to react to it. And that reminded me of some high-profile moments in sport where people have got upset. Zinedine Zidane in the World Cup, Serena Williams in the US Open, I think it was. Both episodes costing them victory. So the second one was with my 6-year-old. He's into Star Wars at the moment. He emptied his box of Lego bricks all over the lounge carpet and asked me to build an Imperial destroyer, which is the little image on the far right there. I said, I can't do that. So he started quoting growth mindset at me then. So I asked him, what is growth mindset? He said, you keep trying and you never give up. And that was what I came up with. So I don't know what you think. Should I audition for Lego Masters or no? But both incidents demonstrated to me how effective psychology can be, even with really, really young kids. So what is sports psychology? Well, it's a relatively new discipline within sports science. So it dates from around the 70s, and it's essentially the study of individual and group dynamics within the context of sport and exercise. So we often use the term sports psychology, but the official title is sport and exercise psychology. So as the name implies, it's got origins in both psychology, so the study of the human mind and behaviour, but also with sports studies as well, so that's primarily physical education. It aims to enhance the sport experience and develop the self through sport. So it's clear then that it's integrating different elements, so it's performance enhancement, personal growth and development, and psychological well-being. So perhaps sports psychology has a wider remit than it first appears. Performance, yes, but also growth and well-being. I'd suggest that these areas are all interlinked and they do impact heavily on each other. Are we going to be safe in here? So why do we need sports psychology? What's the point? There's nothing wrong with me. That's the general assumption. General assumption of what sports psychologists do is fix problems. So when in reality that's really only a small part of what we do. A small part of how we can help athletes, coaches, teams, parents. So yes, we can help fix something when it's not right. But equally, how about the idea that sports psychology could be used to enhance what's already good or great? Nothing's a finished article, nothing's perfect, so we can use sports psychology to improve things. So yeah, we can help athletes to come back from injury, we can help athletes with performance slumps, things like that, but we can also proactively help in countless ways. Another important element of sports psychology is that it allows athletes an opportunity to talk. And by talking, I mean in a way that's different to with their friends or family or coaches who pick the team. Sports psychology offers, certainly in the approach that I take, offers a confidential environment that allows athletes to talk openly with no judgment. And that's what I've found to be one of the most powerful tools, really. So how a sports psychologist works depends on how they approach the discipline. So some psychologists, so on the left of the diagram there, believe that psychology is tightly focused on athletic performance. Others on the right believe that it's about holistic well-being, care and happiness of the person rather than just the athlete. The athlete is just part of the identity. So we've got two ends of a continuum, really. In reality, most psychologists probably position themselves somewhere in the middle. The important point to understand, though, is that depending on their model of practice, psychologists will work with clients in very different ways. Traditionally, sports psychologists have been on the left here with a narrow focus on performance, but more recently there's been a shift to the right. As you would expect, the importance of psychological well-being has come to the fore. At this end, you've got the psychologist as the expert, so as the teacher. At the right-hand end, you've got the psychologist who views the client as the expert on themselves. So the client will help, the psychologist will help the client to uncover answers for themselves. So yes, there are differing approaches, but it's the sports psychologists themselves that's more important than any specific intervention. The biggest single factor in service delivery, and this goes across many, many healthcare professions, is the relationship between the practitioner and the client. So it's vital that the two can build a good rapport for a strong working alliance. So if we start to look at different models of service delivery, how do psychologists account for thoughts, feelings and behaviours? Is the client here normal? How could psychologists understand and help this client? So psychologists may understand and work with clients in different ways, depending on their theoretical perspective or their model of practice. The model the psychologist uses will determine which thoughts, feelings and behaviours are selected as important and which are neglected as being inconsequential. If you go to the doctor with an infection, they might prescribe you antibiotics, and that's based on the traditional medical model. However, if you go to a sports psychologist with an issue, say confidence, how the psychologist approaches that will vary depending on their model of practice. So why do people do the things they do? If you have a quick look at this example up here, you can see as the behaviours described in increasingly kind of abstract terms, eventually we come to the question of what Julie here is striving for, what motivates her behaviour. So there are several possible answers in psychology, and each reflect different assumptions about human nature. So as I said, all models have to account for thoughts, feelings and behaviours. What is it that determines how we think, feel and act as individuals in a variety of the situations we experience? I'll quickly run through these theoretical models to give you a bit of a flavour for each. So the psychodynamic model here is kind of the granddaddy of all models. This was Freud's baby, and he suggested that our behaviour is influenced by unconscious forces, so innate biological instincts and urges. Freud suggested the mind has three levels. He compared it to an iceberg. So the top of the iceberg represents the conscious mind, and that contains all thoughts, memories, feelings and wishes that we're aware of at any given time. And this is the aspect of our mental processing that we can think and talk about rationally. The part of the iceberg that's submerged below the water but still visible is the pre-conscious. So that consists of anything that could potentially be brought into the conscious mind. So things like memory or stored knowledge. And the bulk of the iceberg that lies unseen below the waterline is the unconscious mind. Freud saw that as a reservoir of feelings, thoughts, instincts, urges, fears that are outside of our conscious awareness. So one way to understand how the conscious and unconscious minds operate is to look at what we call a slip of the tongue or a Freudian slip. So these kind of misstatements are believed to reveal underlying unconscious thoughts or feelings. So according to Freud, the unconscious continues to influence our behaviour even though we're unaware of it. Now this theory taught us a lot, but there are a couple of major critiques of the model. The first is that it is deterministic. If our behaviour is controlled by unconscious forces, then we have no free will, no agency, and no responsibility for our actions. And two, the model only accounts for the individual, doesn't account for the environment. So that's the direction that the discipline went in next. So in contrast, we have the behavioural model, which focuses on learning from the environment as the primary force that shapes behaviour. So if we have a nature-nurture continuum, we have psychodynamic theories at one end of the continuum and behavioural theories at the other. So if we look first at classical conditioning, that comes from the Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov at the end of the 19th century. So he was studying salivation in dogs. He'd present the dogs with food, they'd begin to salivate, and he'd measure how much. What happened was that Pavlov's assistant would ring a bell when the food was ready. And what Pavlov found, by chance, was that the dogs started to salivate at the sound of the bell, in anticipation of the food. So what he'd managed to do, he'd paired a biological response, the salivation, to a neutral stimulus, the bell, rather than the food. So the dogs essentially had learned from their environment. Operant conditioning was sort of the next wave of this. Came from renowned psychologist B.F. Skinner. He investigated learning through rewards and punishments. So if you think about training a dog, rewarding good behaviour, punishing bad behaviour. Similarly, the rewards and punishments in our environments shape our behaviour. And the classic study here is Skinner's paper titled Superstition in the Pigeon. If you're superstitious, I'd encourage you to read that, especially if you get a bit twitchy. If I say rats. And then we moved on to socio-cultural conditioning. So that was looking at learning from observation and mimicry of role models. So again, the classic study here is Albert Bandura with these strange-looking Bobo dolls. So what he did, he set up a playroom with a child and an adult in. The adult would punch and kick the doll, then leave the room, and he would observe what the child did. And more often than not, the child would mimic the behaviour of the adult. So again, learning from their environments. So behaviourists suggest that the environment shapes behaviour. The environment is the dominant factor. But in a similar way to those psychodynamic theories, again, under this we have no free will, no agency. We're products of our environment. Now, if we think about that in a sporting context, if you just won a match or a race or a competition and I say well done to you, what am I saying? well done genes, well done environment, you would quite rightly say, well, hang on, I had something to do with that performance. So, yes, there's nature, yes, there's nurture, but there's also an individual involved in the process there with some sort of decision-making capacity. So if we move a step forward then to cognitive theory, which suggests that our thought patterns are the primary forces determining our feelings and our actions. The cognitive model puts its spotlight on mental processes, things like attention, perceptions, memory. The cognitive model views the individual as an active participant in creating reality. Very different to the last two models, where we're kind of a passenger. Cognitive theory argues that how a person interprets external stimuli is more important than the stimulus itself. So it's about perception of those cues. Perception rather than reality. In sports psychology, the basic characteristics of the cognitive model, so its brevity, its focus on the present, its educational nature, have traditionally made it very appealing to athletes and coaches. And although cognitive theory began in opposition to behavioural theory, the two are compatible and are often used together. So you might have heard of the cognitive behavioural approach, you might have heard of cognitive behavioural therapy. That's what we're talking about here. So as I say, it's about perception versus reality with cognitive theory. This cognitive behavioural model is one of the most popular in sport and exercise psychology. So if you think about psychological skills training techniques, relaxation, imagery, goal setting, self-talk, they're probably the most recognisable elements of sports psychology. They're born from this cognitive behavioural approach. Yet, it's, like all the approaches, been criticised for a number of reasons, not least because it lacks kind of a holistic approach to understanding behaviour. So in response, we have the humanistic model, a collection of theories based on humanistic principles. The emphasis here is on personal growth and development, to be the best that you can be. The humanistic model celebrates more the uniqueness of the individual, emphasises the importance of developing the whole person, not just the athlete. Empathy, genuineness, and non-judgmental caring. They distinguish the client-psychologist relationship in the humanistic model. There's a clear distinction here with other models that we've looked at already. Here, the client is positioned as the expert. In the others, the psychologist is positioned as the expert. So the psychologist would work with the client to increase their self-awareness, understanding, self-knowledge, and empower the client to take action for themselves. Now, one of the critiques of the humanistic model is that it's a little too rose-tinted, a little too idealistic maybe. Can we be everything we want to be? Some would argue no. There's a quote from motor racing legend Jackie Stewart: "It's not always possible to be the best, but it is always possible to improve your own performance." Some psychologists would agree with that. They'd argue that whatever our situation, whatever our possibilities, we all have the capability and the ability to make things a little bit better. We can all do something to improve our situation. And that's really where my interest in existential psychology began. So existential psychology, as I said, accuses the humanistic perspective of being incomplete and a bit idealistic. Now, existential psychology concerns itself with the basic givens of human existence and the anxiety that comes along with that as being the main drivers of behaviour. So existentialists suggest that genuine psychological health results from facing up to mortality and living authentically. Authenticity being the degree to which an individual's actions are consistent with their beliefs and desires. So the sports psychologist, according to the existential perspective, exists primarily to assist the performer to become ever more true to themselves. So again, this concept of authenticity. And to accept that personal development is often an uncomfortable experience. Furthermore, although the aim is to assist the person in order to enhance their performance in sport, the existential approach believes that no real or lasting growth and development in performance can occur unless the performer is prepared to engage in that personal and committed struggle towards self-knowledge. So self-knowledge, self-awareness is what leads to long-lasting growth with this approach. So a moment when an individual questions whether their life has meaning, purpose, whether it has value, can be called an existential crisis. So this issue of meaning and the purpose of existence is a major focus for existentialism. Because in the existential tradition, meaning drives behaviour. So here's an example of an existential crisis. I hope the sound works okay. We'll give it a go and see what happens. Yeah.
Buzz Lightyear! Do you read me? Buzz Lightyear responded, reading loud and clear. Buzz Lightyear, planet Earth needs your help. On the way! Buzz Lightyear, the world's greatest superhero now, the world's greatest toy. Buzz has it all. Flossy, quick communicator. Whoa, Buzz Lightyear. Divine capture. Holy laser light. Multi-ray voice simulator. Permissions in uncharted space. High-pressure space wings! To infinity and beyond! Get your Buzz Lightyear action figure and save a galaxy near you! Buzz Lightyear! Available at all Alice Toy Mountain outlets. It's right down here.
Out among the stars I stand, way beyond the moon. In my silver ship I stand, dream it ended too soon. Now I know exactly who I am and what I'm here for. You are a toy you can't buy. And I will go sailing no more. But no, it can't be true. I could fly if I wanted to. A bird in the sky, if I believed I could fly. Why I'd fly to infinity and beyond. Clearly I will go sailing no more.
So that's the moment that Buzz realises that he's just a toy. So that's his existential crisis, if you like. He's not what he thought he was. But if you've seen the film, you'll know he picks himself up. He creates a new narrative, new purpose, new meaning. and he learns that while his abilities are not what he thought they were, there's nothing wrong with the abilities that he does have. He doesn't need to reconsider his core personality or those things that make Buzz Buzz. So again, I hope that demonstrates meaning and purpose as the drivers of behaviour in the existential approach. I appreciate there's a lot of information we've gone through there, but I think it's important to try and clarify how these different models work in terms of thoughts, feelings and actions. So we shift gears a bit now and talk about some of the practical applications of sports psychology. As we've already seen, these are the most basic elements of sports psychology. You've probably heard of them. Elite athletes, generally highly skilled in these techniques. It's not to say they don't need help with them from time to time, but generally they're pretty good when it comes to mental skills. That's how they've got to where they are. Where I believe sports psychology can have the biggest impact with these sorts of techniques is with novice and youth athletes. What we'd like is to help athletes acquire these skills as early as possible, to accelerate their learning, so they perform to a high standard more consistently. And now with young people, the people who have the most contact time with them, obviously parents first, coaches maybe a bit more contact time. So I think as sports psychologists, that's the route we need to go down, to educate parents and coaches on how to use and teach these techniques. That's the way to positively impact the most people. And the benefits, of course, are holistic then in terms of performance, personal development, psychological well-being, and those benefits extend far beyond sport. This is an example of a cognitive behavioural technique I've used with young athletes to help them with unhelpful beliefs. A nice little framework to help them gain that self-awareness and then to take action to create more helpful beliefs. So it's an ABC model. We have the A and the C there. So that's the predominant way of thinking. The A causes C. We have a big national competition coming up. That causes me to be nervous to the point where it negatively affects my performance. Something happens, so we're reacting in a negative manner. The more astute of you will have realised there's something missing from our ABC model. The B. So what this smarter thinking framework suggests is that it's not A that causes C, but there's something in between, this unhelpful belief. So something happens, we've got a neutral event, then we have our unhelpful belief about it, which causes negative consequences. So the belief that I always mess up in big competitions is really what's causing those negative consequences. And as a psychologist, I can then work with the athlete to help replace that unhelpful belief with something that's more helpful and will lead to more helpful consequences. Some other practical examples of work I've done with different organisations. So first, we do a lot of workshops on different psychological topics. With younger athletes, it's often around similar areas: confidence, nerves, resilience, focus, things like that. With older team groups, workshops I've found are more useful to instigate those sort of deeper conversations, more vulnerable conversations between teammates, so they get to know each other better, and when they know each other better they can work together more cohesively, and that leads to better performance, a more productive team. Second, we've looked at developing an age-specific education programme for athletes in a particular sporting context. So we're looking to develop a graduated and more flexible approach to age-specific psychological-based education in response to the needs of the players, coaches and parents that were in that environment. And the third there was an infographic produced to instigate some meaningful conversations between parents and kids around the psychological aspects of sport. I think it's important for parents and kids to be having these conversations so that all parties understand the significance of these psychological attributes. Often overlooked, but again, the key differentiator, more often than not, at a high level. Again, we touched on exercise psychology before, but that's another element of the role. So that's more focused on participation rather than performance, but the approach is very similar. So self-determination theory is a prominent theory concerned with motivation. It suggests that motivation comes when three basic psychological needs are satisfied. So autonomy, that's the freedom to choose. Relatedness, quality of relationships. And competence, that would be around positive feedback. So in successful exercise programs, if you think of things like the walk and talk on the island, park run, you can see self-determination theory in action. So autonomy, people are choosing to do it of their own free will. Relatedness, both programs encourage participants to meet up afterwards for a coffee and a chat. And competence, so people are getting positive feedback through, maybe they're getting a t-shirt for having done 50 park runs, or they're getting certificates for how many laps of the track they've walked. Also, self-determination theory can be used effectively in a gym scenario. So let's say a client loses motivation and he's going to leave a gym. The client suffers from an exercise and health perspective. The gym suffers because they have to spend more money on marketing looking for new clients. So gym owners and personal trainers can identify when people's attendance at the gym starts to drop off. We, as psychologists, can start to intervene at that point. When motivation starts to flag, we can help clients to reconnect with their underlying purpose. And that should result in benefits for all parties. So if I move now on to some of my research, I think it's important first just to draw your attention to the two differing research methodologies. So quantitative methods look to collect numerical data through instruments like questionnaires and analyse that data using statistical models and then make generalisations to a wider population. Qualitative methods, by comparison, they look to obtain a rich depth of information through interviews, observations, that sort of thing. So quantitative methods looking more at generalisable patterns, qualitative methods looking to understand individual experiences. So with my journey, as you'll see, I started out using quantitative methods, probably due to that kind of statistical background, but then I've moved on to using predominantly qualitative methods. So this was my undergraduate dissertation at the University of Derby. What differentiates finishers from non-finishers in the parish walk? Could someone's level of grit predict whether they would finish the parish walk or not? So grit was kind of a trendy topic area at the time, and I thought it might be interesting to investigate that in the context of the parish walk. And that's an event where people will routinely tell you that it's more mental than physical, although Graham might disagree. So this was a quantitative study. Participants took part in the 2016 parish walk, and then 126 of those people took part in a survey that I sent out, so that's a decent enough sample size. A range of ages, 18 to 74, and a pretty even split of male and female competitors. So they all completed an online questionnaire to measure grit, and I also collected some other data from them, some demographic data. So I ran a statistical analysis of the data and found that higher grit scores were associated with an increased likelihood of finishing the parish walk. A person's grit score was a far better predictor of whether they'd finish than the amount of training they'd done. It's quite an interesting finding. So we had another interesting finding, that grit increases with age, as you can see in the diagram there. So this suggests that grit might not be that stable, enduring personality trait that it's professed to be. Perhaps it's more of a skill. And if it's a skill, it can be trained. So for younger or novice athletes, training grit alongside their normal physical training could improve outcomes. So the next stage of this would maybe to be go on and test some grit interventions. So take some prospective participants, put them through a grit intervention and then see how they performed in the parish walk. Haven't got round to that yet. Maybe somebody here would like to take that baton on, but I think that would be a really interesting study. So my next piece of research, sticking with the Isle of Man theme, was moving from the parish walk to TT. This also signified a move away from quantitative methods to qualitative, something that was completely new to me. And that was when I started to take an interest in this existential approach as well. So this piece of research involved life history interviews with 4 TT riders, active and retired. They were all TT winners or guys with multiple podiums, so high-end competitors. Essentially looking, it wasn't about motivation, that was too superficial, it was more about what brought them into motorbikes and eventually to TT. So the first theme that I identified was around some key moments or boundary situations. For 3 of the participants, their path was characterised by these boundary situations, so experiences of struggle or suffering, where kind of stark facts limit human freedom, if you like. So in sport, boundary situation has been used to describe transitions such as retirement, career-ending injury, deselection, change of team, things like that. So this participant's journey to the TT was centred on the idea that he might have to give up riding his motorbike, not being able to continue doing what he loved, and this was all due to the huge debt he'd run up through racing. So he'd considered suicide as a way of resolving that. As it turned out, he was offered a package to ride at the TT. He chose that option, which meant he could continue racing short circuits, and he wouldn't then have that financial burden. So in this case for him, TT was a means to an end. Second theme revolved around TT as a site for thriving and engaging fully with life. So the suggestion that participation at TT can actually enhance psychological well-being. The types of experience described by people were, they could be characterised as transcendental or spiritual or mystical. They used that kind of phraseology. So now it's been suggested that those types of experiences can only exist in opposition to a more mundane way of living. And that sort of contrast between transcendent and mundane is quite clear in that quote there. And drawing this distinction between living and existing is not new insight. It's been around about 2,000 years. So living and existing are not necessarily the same thing. So this is Seneca, a Stoic philosopher, 2,000 years ago, with a very, very similar quote. So I was getting some really, actually deep philosophical insight from these TT riders. So finally on this, participants gave me many examples of injuries they'd suffered over the years, and this is a prime example of one of them. So I felt that developing a deeper understanding of how riders stay committed to the sport, the kind of psychological processes that help them, and the mental health implications during these long periods when they're unable to compete, and that was research that I wanted to go into, and that's kind of led into my more current projects. I've taken the expletives out of this, by the way. So the first paper that I went on to from that was a literature review paper. We wanted to understand the psychological factors associated with positive rehabilitation outcomes in elite athletes following serious injury. So we did this using a technique called meta-ethnography, which takes a number of qualitative studies. It analyses and interprets the findings that are there to come up with new insight and conclusions from that same primary data. So we searched online databases for relevant studies. Initially we identified over 1,000 studies, but we managed to reduce that down to a manageable 14 once we'd sifted out papers that didn't quite fit our requirements. So we then looked at the common themes in those studies, and we looked at key differences to try and come up with a model of this long-term injury experience. And this is the model we came up with, a theory of how to conceptualise this rehabilitation and return to competitive sport process. Again, we were integrating existential themes that were prevalent in the literature and in the previous study that I'd done. And we came up with, it's probably difficult to see, but we came up with 3 temporal phases. So an inactive phase immediately after the injury, a proactive phase, and then a reflective phase. So our argument suggests that because serious injury constitutes a boundary situation, we need to consider these existential challenges, and therefore we need a psychological model that integrates these existential themes. So we looked at things like social support, personal coping resources, knowledge and experience, their ways to help deal with these existential threats, if you like. So an interesting element of this first inactivity stage, that was characterised by feelings of helplessness and despair, isolation from teammates. I spoke to an athlete on Monday who was injured, and the first thing he said to me was about how he felt lonely. So this is, something I'm seeing on the ground as well as in the research. And this phase appears to vary in length depending on a number of factors, really. But it seems initially that those athletes with complex identities, so those athletes that have things away from sport, are able to reconnect quicker and get into that rehabilitation process quicker. So those things going on outside of sport, maybe it's a partner, maybe it's kids, maybe it's a business, but it just seems that those kind of athletes are quicker to accept the injury, and then they're quicker to move on. So practical implications resulting from this study. The first, peer support was seen as critical, but genuine empathic support is perhaps only available from athletes who've experienced something similar. So this is a quote from last year's TT programme. That's John McGuinness talking about his experience with injury, and following that, his appreciation of what Ian Hutchinson must have gone through with his injury experiences. Second, in the aftermath of serious injury, how can we as psychologists help athletes to confront these existential challenges, the loss of meaning? How can we help them through that inactivity phase so they rehab quicker, so they get back to performing at a high level quicker, so they get better contracts, earn more money, have a more exciting life, have a happy life? And then another one I'm on at the moment, exploring individual athletes' experiences of injury and then trying to describe that injury experience. So I've interviewed 2 riders so far. I've got a couple more interviews lined up. Again, we're in the existential realm with this. Some interesting themes emerging around meaning and isolation. So a couple of quotes to give you a bit of insight. The first was a rider talking about his thoughts immediately after the crash. Some, I think, really powerful, thought-provoking, deep philosophical stuff there. The second talks about feelings of helplessness and despair at the start of the recovery process. The analogy of being stuck at the bottom of a well with no light. Again, a really powerful quote. And again, the suggestion here is a lack of purpose or meaning. So that's the one I'm on at the moment. And this is what's to come. Already made a start on these 2. So the first, a study looking at the development of expertise in TT riders. So that's an autobiographical study. I've taken 4 autobiographies from top TT riders. I'm looking at common themes through there, looking at ways to identify how we can accelerate learning in younger racers. The second's in horse racing. So the sport of kings, the richest sport in Britain, worth about £5 billion to the UK economy. So we've got a remit from the Racing Foundation to do some research looking around the experiences of female jockeys in the British horse racing industry. And that will be starting next week, hopefully. I'm almost on time. Appreciate I've covered a lot of ground. I've thrown a lot at you. That was deliberate. We've got quite a varied audience, so I wanted everybody to be able to take something from it. So hopefully you've learned something, something you can take away, or it's inspired you to read more about different topic areas. I just find it a fascinating discipline, to be honest. If you want to learn more, I've got a couple of papers out. You can read those. Have a look at the M Word podcast. I did an episode with them about my story, but they do, all their podcasts are on motivation, psychological aspects, so really, really interesting. I'm sure you get something out of those. And if you're interested in existential psychology, then I'd recommend Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. He talks about how we can find meaning through suffering, how we can respond, imbue life with purpose. Two exciting talks left, so get booked on Eventbrite for tickets. It'll be standing room only for those, I'm sure.
Thank you, Richard.
So that's how you can contact me, but I'm happy to take any questions you might have. Yeah?
I have a question with regards to the ABC model, in the fact that is that like sort of model affected by like the placebo effect? Because it's like if the belief that someone will do something in a certain way will lead to a consequence, if it's affected by the placebo effect, will the consequence differ in that case?
Yeah, good question. Thank you. It's about identifying the belief and how it is impacting on performance. So, is it having a beneficial effect? If it's an irrational belief, but it's having a beneficial effect, then I would leave it alone. If it's having an unhelpful effect, then yes, we would start to look at that. We'd maybe drill down as to where that belief comes from, because there's probably something deeper, and this is what you'll find with psychology is once you start scratching at the surface, it just goes deeper and deeper and deeper. But that smarter thinking, that comes from a therapy called rational emotive behaviour therapy, which was actually the original cognitive therapy. So there's a good grounding in that, but I do find it useful with younger athletes, even if it's only to investigate what the issue is. We might go more down a counselling approach, but it's a very good investigative tool, I think.
Thanks very much, Richard. That's very interesting. Do you think people try harder because, perhaps in sport, where they actually love it, and they can actually, because they love it, they've got faith in it, perhaps got faith in themselves, and they can then aspire to a higher thing? Whereas when you compare it to a work situation, you may not actually love that, you just go through emotions. So do you think that's the main difference?
I can speak from a personal perspective, being in a job that I didn't love. I think authenticity is the thing that comes up with me in that position. I was doing something that I didn't particularly want to do, but I kept justifying it to myself. There was good reasons to do this and carry on doing it. And whereas I think, again, when we go deep into core beliefs and values, actually, what do I want out of this? I don't want to be sitting at a desk for 8 hours a day hating it. That's not life for me. So that's when I started looking sort of internally, really. I think with sport and work, maybe it is that purpose and meaning. And I have heard it anecdotally as well, that counsellors have gone into a work environment, help people get to their core beliefs and values, discover their purpose and meaning, and then they've left because they've realised it's not what they want to do. Yeah, I know, because you've got an interest in positive psychology, haven't you? Is that right?
I'm interested.
Yeah.
So I do believe that sort of mix of belief and faith in either yourself or in a subject.
Yeah.
Does enable you to see more opportunities.
Yeah.
Move on, absolutely.
I think the humanistic and existential, I think they work well together. It's just getting that balance. Yeah, for me. Again, psychology, it's subjective. So, as I was trying to get across, everyone will have a slightly different view on it.
I was just interested in the routes that people go down to get referred or to self-refer or to access. So thinking in terms of, in a workplace, people in the well-being context, maybe where they're trying to use sport as a way of exercise, and then younger people trying to help them to get support early on, when you can identify maybe sport's a very important part of their life and what we can do. So how does that happen? Do they get referred by a GP, or is it sport teams, or can they self-refer?
Refer to a sports psychologist. It would be a coach or a physio often. Parents, a lot of young people come through parents. The parents see frustration, anger, frustration, those types of behaviours. So child is a bit frustrated with sport. That obviously comes home then, and it spills out, it affects the whole family then. So that's a route that people take. I think in terms of, maybe you're thinking referrals in terms of clinical referrals, so you get referred to a clinical psychologist for something like a mental health issue.
But just in any way, I was thinking also in terms of the social inclusion, about the costs for people.
Yeah.
How does that work?
I guess it's just on the individual. It's like any sort of sports science discipline, I would say. If you feel you need to go and see a physio, or you want to go and see a trainer or a nutritionist, it's just similar. It's your own volition. Yeah. Graham?
Do you think that people that seek help with the psychological side of things, individuals in sport, the ones who actually seek it, probably are will get less benefit. The ones that don't seek it will probably benefit more. If that makes sense, I never expressed it properly, but basically the people that need it most won't ask for it. Did you find that?
Yeah, I think the ones who are determined to make if we're talking high-end performance sport, the ones who are determined to make it to the top will leave no stone unturned. So that includes psychology and the other disciplines that we've talked about. Can it help? Yeah, I think it can help anybody, whatever their level, and even if it is, you're struggling to get out every day to go for a run or whatever it might be. So, yeah, we sort of channel everything into sport, but there is this exercise side, which arguably is much, much bigger than sport, which is perhaps something we should be doing more about. But I think psychology can help everyone. We can all do a bit better, can't we? I would say.
Well, it all takes a bit of time to pack up, so I'm sure you can talk to Richard one-to-one if you want to before you go, because basically you're making those available for people to come to.
Yeah, I'll give those slides to you, yeah.
But, because we can still clap our own hands, we're not supposed to shake each other's hand, but we can offer a thank you to